Today on Empowered Kids TV.
Last week, Alfie Kohn called bluff on the claim that we can spoil our kids. This week we take the conversation further by exploring how conditional parenting techniques impact our kids' self-esteem. We'll also explore what it takes to develop a stable sense of self. Alfie Kohn writes and speaks widely on human behavior, education and parenting. His 13th book is titled The Myth of a Spoiled Child, Challenging the Conventional Wisdom About Children and Parenting. Kohn's work has been translated into 16 languages. Of his earlier titles, the best known are Punished by Rewards, No Contest, The Case Against Competition, and Unconditional Parenting, Moving from Rewards and Punishment to Love and Reason. Kohn has been described in the Times magazine as perhaps the most outspoken critic of education's fixation on grades and test scores. He has been featured on hundreds of TV and radio programs, including The Today Show and 2 appearances on Oprah.
Can we turn our attention a bit to self-esteem, because you cover self-esteem quite a bit in the new book. There's also a claim that while we're trying to boost our kids, not only do we overcoddle, but we also run the risk of raising a generation of kids that have an inflated sense of self. Is it actually possible to have too much self-esteem?
No, not unless you define high self-esteem as grandiosity or narcissism or something else pathological, which is exactly what some conservative psychologists have tried to do, to sort of load the dice here. The research clearly shows that while high self-esteem is not a psychological panacea, it doesn't always make people morally sophisticated and exemplary. It doesn't always help them to be better students. High self-esteem is almost always better than low self-esteem. And I haven't seen any evidence to the contrary. But when you dig a little deeper, you find that it's not just how much self-esteem you have that matters. It's whether that self-esteem is conditional or unconditional. So conditional self-esteem means I think I'm a good person only when I ...
Right.
There are strings attached. I believe in myself. I have faith in myself. I think of myself as competent and worthwhile only when I do well in school or make a lot of money or when I'm attractive or slim or funny or well-behaved if I'm a child. And that turns out to be deadly, psychologically speaking. Worse than low self-esteem is self-esteem with conditions attached. And so what we want kids to develop is that unconditional core of belief in themselves that even when they screw up or fall short, they still know they're good people. And now this is very ironic that that's what the evidence says, because conservatives are driven nuts by the idea of unconditionality. Worse than self-esteem itself, worse than high self-esteem, worse than programs to raise self-esteem. What infuriates them is the idea that kids would have high self-esteem without having earned the right to feel good about themselves. That we've loosened that conditionality. And that's where the notion of inflated self-esteem comes from. Not just, the question of you have to do this to feel good about yourself. Not just that you have to do this much to feel good about yourself, but that the two have to be connected at all. So the basic conservative critique of the self-esteem movement, which they tie in with all kinds of other things, with getting good marks in school too easily, with getting praise without having done anything truly impressive, with getting stickers or trophies, at a football match just for trying. All of this is based on a profoundly conservative and I think deeply troubling notion that you only get this if you do that. Like, it's as if every interaction, even with children, has to be an economic transaction. There's no free lunch. And this reaches its apotheosis with the indictment of inflated self-esteem, when it turns out that what conservatives are telling us, that kids should have to do more to feel good about themselves or get parental approval, is what undermines healthy development.
I've started, because I've been following your work for some time now, moving away from that doing to approach and towards the working with approach. There are times when it just feels really challenging and you just want your kids to just get on and do as they've been told. For us, that happens almost every morning just as we're about to leave the house to get ready for school. We're either bang on time or we're late. And just as we're about to walk through the door, somebody decides, I don't want to go to school today, or I don't want to wear these shoes today. And it just feels easier. And that's exactly what it is. It feels easier if sometimes you offer a carrot or some sort of tiny reward to say, let's get going quickly. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yes, I dealt with this in some detail in an earlier book called Unconditional Parenting, which was more about what to do. But you're clearly right. I mean, I'm the parent of 2 children, and I know sometimes all you care about is you want to get them into the car or out of the car or into bed or into the bathtub or out of the bathtub, and you're focused on just that short-term compliance. And the more you're focused on short-term compliance, the more likely you are to offer a bribe or a threat. Because the one thing that bribes and threats can buy is short-term compliance, but at a terrific cost. They can never engender a commitment to the action or the value underlying something. In fact, exactly the opposite is true. The more you reward kids for doing something, the more they tend to lose interest in whatever they had to do to get a reward. And the same is true for punishments or threats. The main effects of punishments and rewards, even if we choose to call them by euphemisms like consequences, or positive reinforcement, but they're bribes and threats. One effect is to make the relationship between you and your child strained. Now the child comes to see you as someone to be feared and avoided if you're used to imposing punishments, or as a goodie dispenser on legs, if you're offering rewards. What do I get for this? Neither is the kind of caring alliance we need to have with kids. The second effect of both is that they make kids more self-centered. If you threaten kids with punitive consequences, they come to ask, what do they want me to do, and what happens to me if I don't do it? If you offer rewards, including praise, by the way, which is just a verbal reward, kids come to ask, what do they want me to do, and what do I get for doing it? Those questions, first of all, are very similar to each other, because rewards and punishments are not opposites. They're 2 sides of the same coin. But both of them are very different from the question I think we want kids to ask, which is, what kind of person do I want to be? Or how do I want to make the people around me feel? So I gave one example, and I'm not suggesting this is what everyone should do, but I gave an example about the very scenario you described of kids who take forever to get out the door in the morning, where it happened to me with my daughter Abigail when she was about 4 years old. And what I did was I sat down with her, not then when we were in a hurry, but later when we had time, and we were in everyone's in a good mood before bath, and I laid out the problem. You take forever to get, and I start nagging you. And then I said to her, what do I sound like? And she did this frightening impersonation of me, a little unsettling. And then I basically just said, what do you think we could do to solve this problem so that you're ready on time, and, I'm not nagging you. And she thought for a minute, and she said, well, I take a lot of time to get dressed, so I should just wear my clothes to bed. And I couldn't think of any reason why not to do that. And so I said, sure, let's try that out and see how it works. And so she tried it out the next day and basically continued to do it for about the next 7 years. And, it kind of helped. But the important thing is that I didn't treat her like a pet, as if I was house training a puppy, by bribing or threatening her into obedience. I asked her, what do you think we can do? And if she had come up with an idea that clearly couldn't have worked, if it wouldn't hurt anyone, I'd say, let's try it anyway, and then revisit the question later. But the important thing is I brought her in on the decision-making. And this is a very sort of rambling way of getting to this point in response to your question. What we do depends on what our most important goal is. If my goal is just to get the kid out the door at a certain time, regardless of the effects on the child or on our relationship, then I might be tempted to use a reward or a consequence. But if my goal is for children to become resourceful and responsible and helpful and happy and to have a good relationship so they want to spend time with me, even when they don't have to, then I will never use a punishment or reward. Better that they be late than that I screw things up by manipulating them like that.
How do we begin as parents to evaluate the stability of our kids' self-esteem? What things should we be looking for?
The extent to which they feel uncertain, not just about whether they've done something well, but whether they themselves are worthy. And I think there's lots of ways that kids and adults express doubts about that. I mean, it's natural to feel better about yourself and the world when you've been successful at something, and to feel sad or disappointed in yourself when you've screwed up, when you've made a really bad decision, when you haven't done something you think you ought to be able to do. That's fine. I'm not suggesting everything is at a perfectly even level. But that feeling of disappointment or pride in oneself shouldn't get at the core of how I feel about myself. So if your kid is saying, I'm no good, or even expressing that through a kind of anger and grumpiness that's chronic and seems to be more than just a passing bad mood, that suggests a kind of self-doubt that only goes away temporarily when somebody's given the kid a patronizing pat on the head, or the kid gets a good grade in school, that's when it's time to worry. And that's when or even before this happens better, we should be letting kids know that you're a good person and a worthwhile person, not only in spite of the fact that sometimes you screw up, but it's most important to remember that on those occasions. And what leads to that outcome is parental love that is unconditional. So I think your question is interesting. What signs should we look for in the child? But I would couple that with a different question, which is, what should we look for in our own parenting, in our interaction with the child? Do we seem to be more excited about our children, to be more loving, to be more affectionate, to give them more attention and care when they've lived up to our expectations, either by being impressive at school or sports, or by being well-behaved and compliant? Because that's the main predictor to conditional self-esteem, is conditional esteem by others.
What can we do if we've identified that the stability of our kids' self-esteem is not where it needs to be? What things can we begin to change within our parenting approach or within our families to help our kids regain that sense of stability?
The things we say, our body posture, our tone of voice, our facial expression, to try to see whether we're giving kids the message that we love them no matter what. We have to love our kids for who they are, not for what they do. And what matters more than our intention, since I think most parents, if you ask, would say, of course I love my child no matter what. What matters is the message that's received by the child. That's what predicts the outcome, not what we think of as our behavior or our motive. And if we're lucky enough to have a co-parent, then we should ask our co-parent to kind of check us on this. And if the child is old enough, we should ask the child, honey, if I ever give you the message that you have to earn my love, or that I turn it on or off depending on what you do, let me know, because that's not the message I ever want to give you.
How do we approach the scenario where within our homes we're actually trying to move away from the doing to approach and the working with approach, move away from that sort of conditional love, but our kids go to a school environment that's still based on conditions? How do we then balance the two places so that our kids get a consistent message?
I think by doing two things at the same time, a short-run approach and a long-run approach, and they're both important. The short-run approach is to minimize the damage if they're getting this message at school, to give them a kind of symbolic immunization, so that they're inoculated against the rewards and punishments and control that many schools still use. And that may mean talking explicitly with children about why people who are in schools do this, not in a way that's disrespectful of the teachers and administrators, but to help them figure out what's going on so that they can be in that environment without being taken over by it. They have a sense of perspective and distance on what's going on, and they don't fall prey to this, I've got to jump through the hoops to get a goodie. That the long-run approach is to reach out to the educators. And again, to do that respectfully, to give them an article or a book, perhaps, a video, or to sit down. And if you have other parents who share those concerns, the more parents who ask to meet with a teacher or a school administrator, the better. To invite them to rethink the use of bribes and threats, the difference between a doing to school and a working with school. When I wrote my book almost 10 years ago called Unconditional Parenting, I immediately started thinking about this question because I'd already written a lot about education, but also because I got so many damn emails from parents asking exactly what you just asked. And so I wrote an article, which is available on my website, called Unconditional Teaching, where I reach out to teachers directly in a magazine for educators to invite them to think about the message they want to give to their students. Do you want your students to come back to you years from now and say, I knew that even when I misbehaved, even when I didn't do my homework, even when I let you down, that you always believed in me. You always cared about me. That was something I never had to worry about. Can you imagine that? Now ask how you're treating your students now and how likely it is that your students would come back and say that in 10 years.
Thank you so much, Alfie, for sharing with us today. I think you were able to help us, again, make that shift mentally from the doing to approach to the working with approach as we guide our kids. So thank you very much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thanks for your questions.
It's time for Empowered Actions. At Empowered Kids, we believe that insight without action is worthless. So let's get to work. Identify the times or circumstances when your kids misbehave. Then, try to identify the emotions they were feeling or struggling to manage. This will give you a clear indication of where you need to support them. Which emotions do you need an action plan for? We'll explore developing an action plan in another video. Next week, Laurie Petro of Teach True Love will be joining us as we discuss alternatives to punishment. Be sure to join us. Did you enjoy this video? I hope so. If you did, click the like button. We can all learn from each other as parents, so come on over to empoweredkidstv.com. There, the conversation always continues after the video ends. You can share your views and your experiences in the comment section below. Finally, remember, the aim is to expand our collective awareness as parents, so be sure to share with a friend or two today. They will love you for it.